Recording, check. Check, okay, there's the level. There's the level. That mic is on.
Is that working?
Yes, sir. Very good.
Okay.
That is on you. We have 19 minutes. I guess if maybe battery, maybe it's battery. All right,
I don't know.
let's get to it.
We'll talk real fast, huh?
That is recording as well. Okay, cool. I see that. Okay. Hello. This is Dr. Ed Davis.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. This is Reed Sowell doing the interview. This is for the Project on Segregation for Public History, and he so graciously agreed to give us his time. So, anyway, all right. Well, so we'll kind of. So, what's your background here? How did you? Let's see. Sorry, I'm gonna go to the specific questions. We'll edit this so it doesn't have to be all in one thing. Okay. All right. So let's do. What was your life like when you arrived here in Huntsville, and maybe what you did, and how you were involved in the community or the church.
Okay, I arrived in Huntsville in June of 1966
Wow.
to teach summer school. I'd been called at North Texas University, and one of my professors came to me and said, Sam Houston needs somebody to teach first summer session. And I said yes.
Mm.
And then after I had been here for a couple of weeks, they asked me if I would stay and teach the second summer session.
Mm-hmm.
And after I had been here for 3 days in the second summer session, says, would you like to stay?
Oh, really?
And since my last degree was from the University of North Texas,
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't stay there as a permanent position because you don't hire your own in universities. And so I accepted the job and did not wind up teaching in North Texas that fall.
Mm-hmm.
I taught what was called the Department of Government in those days, now called the Department of Political Science.
Department of Government became Political Science. So you were hired on there and then began teaching. And
Yeah, I had a master's in public administration. I didn't have a doctorate. So after I taught here 1 year, I took a leave of absence and wound up at Texas Tech University to work on a doctorate, then came back.
And what was your doctorate in?
Doctorate was in political science.
Oh, wow. Very cool. Awesome. Well, how did you, let's see, so occupation. Okay, so tell me a little bit about the church that you were involved in and sort of what you had understood as maybe the relations between the races, or how all that was viewed in the 60s, or your perspective. It's kind of open-ended there, kind of what we talked about earlier, prevailing opinion, congregation, race relations talked about, or they talked about that sort of thing.
Okay, just prod me where you need to.
Okay.
All right, I got here in June of 1966, leaving my wife and 2 children in Irving, Texas, where I had been teaching public school. Actually, after I left the city of Irving, I wound up teaching public school for
Okay.
4 years. And came down to see the situation, lived in the dormitory at Whitehall
Uh-huh.
that summer, and went home on weekends like most of the students did, see who could get out of town first.
Wow.
And decided to move on down here, and got associated with St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, which was right on the campus. It's where the placement office is now. It's the old church
I've seen that.
on, I guess, 16th and J. And didn't go real regularly, but got there long enough to get elected to the vestry, which is kind of like the Board of Deacons for those that need a comparison.
Mm-hmm.
And the priest at that time was a guy by the name of Al Johnson. Big, huge man, probably weighed 325 pounds.
Al
if
Johnson.
He weighed an ounce, yeah. And I liked Al. Had 2 most misbehaved kids I ever met, but I liked Al and his wife. And he was a leader in the civil rights movement in Huntsville at that time, and had been engaged in several of the marches that took place around the square and other places in
Here in Huntsville?
So
Wow.
he was an activist, and he was not accompanied by a lot of other clergy.
Right.
Most of the clergy stayed home.
Right.
And Al did not. And I don't know why. I never had that conversation with
Mhm.
Al, but he was not hamstrung by the Southern culture. And indeed, he wasn't raised in the South, so that may explain it. But he thought segregation was wrong. He was in a minority. I wouldn't even guess that the church agreed with him in the majority.
Wow.
I think it probably caused a lot of friction in the church. A lot of people wanted to get rid of him
Because
of his stand on integration.
and he was the main minister for
He
the
was the minister.
he was the minister
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
St. Stephen's Episcopal.
Yeah, and that doesn't surprise me.
Right.
When I see the racism in America that exists now, and I see that raised by the election of Trump, I beg your pardon, Obama.
Right. Right. And
The fact that he was black, I mean, you could just feel hostility
Mhm.
occur. And then Trump became and stirred the pot
right.
and has encouraged it, and so it's out in the open like never before.
Wow. Well, maybe not previously to in the Jim Crow era. Well, what?
I
Sorry, go ahead.
when I got here, I did not engage in a march. The marches seemed to have been over when I got here, and there was conflict in certainly the public schools. The Huntsville public schools, like those throughout the state and throughout the South and throughout a lot of the border states, were not about to integrate. It was going to take a gun to their head to do it. Brown versus the Board of Education was 1954, the first case, 1955, the second case. But it took until 1969 for the Fifth Court of Appeals, which is the court that supervises Texas and other states, to argue that all deliberate speed, which was the pace of integration that came, in the original decisions, and nobody could define all deliberate
Right.
speed. So there were an awful lot of studying going on how to do things,
Mhm.
appoint a committee and drag your feet.
Right.
And so the Huntsville schools were not getting very far with integration when I came in '66.
Okay. What did you become an active member in the church, or what role did the church have in the community? And then, during that time, what was your stance with that? Did you kind of see the conflict and or what was kind of your take on that? And then possibly leading into like the social, maybe in the church setting, or maybe what you experienced, social interactions between the different ethnicities, or maybe if you had any more about Al, but
Okay, well, everything is complex, actually. The church was not highly involved. Only Al was involved in
Okay.
early integration, as far as I can tell.
uh-huh.
And I, in 1968, ran and became the chairman of the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
And as chairman of the Democratic Party, I got to meet a couple of African American men who were election judges or precinct judges in certain precincts where housing dictated that was an African American precinct.
Oh, okay.
And one of them was by the name of Wendell Baker, which is pretty well known in this area. Wendell was a civil rights worker. He was a chemical engineer, actually, but he had to go to Beaumont to find a job. But he'd come home every weekend and try to organize the blacks to engage in political activities, at least vote, and make themselves well known. And frankly, my interaction in my life before that was such that I didn't have much interaction with people that were unlike me,
Right.
which I think is probably what most people experience. It's actually in the 70s that I think St. Stephen's Church became more engaged in the community than it was during the Civil Rights era.
Okay.
There were a couple of people who were real go-getters, real bright and energetic people
In the congregation?
in the congregation, one of them being Joyce Hilliard. And Joyce became a member of the school board later on in life, but Joyce created a summer program, or with a few others who I don't know who they all were, created what was called the Huntsville Enrichment Activity Program, which is still going on. It's been going on 40 some odd years, which was programmed for kids during the summer. We're held over on 190 where the junior high and the 6th grade are located, and they're still going on there. So that's one of the legacies of Joyce, and I'm sure there's some other members of the church that I don't know played a role in that. There were people outside the church that played a role in that.
In the church, did those programs involve mixing of the races, or was it?
Those programs did, because by the 70s, uh, there was integration. Because remember that I said the Fifth Court of Appeals in 1969 gave a definition of what all delivery
Oh.
speed means, and they said all delivery speed means September of 1969. No more fooling around.
Right.
Huntsville was engaged in a grade-a-year program, which would mean it would take 13 years between kindergarten and 12th grade before you had full integration. And that was a strategy used throughout the South.
Wow.
One grade at a time. So finally they got, and that decision in 69 wasn't at Huntsville directly, but it affected the entire South. It just didn't apply to one school district. That's when integration really began, after 1969.
Wow. Here in Huntsville specifically. Wow.
And then whether it's a spurious relationship or an accidental relationship, the church became more active in the community in the
church
70s,
did.
which is right after that. Not only did the church play a huge role in creating Huntsville Enrichment Activity Program,
Which
but it
involved
played a huge
African
role
American.
in creating COME, the Christian Organization for Missionary Endeavor. It's now called the Community Organization rather than the Christian Organization, but it's over on Highway 75 North, and is a major distribution points for household goods and clothing and things like that for people that need help. And that's been going on for 40 plus years as well. So these two major things really came out of St. Stephen's Church.
St. Stephen's Church.
And
he's obviously.
and that engaged the people that took part in that, then obviously are saying, we're willing to mix with people that don't look like us.
Right.
Because it was open to anyone, no questions asked.
Wow.
You know, and you could buy something for a quarter, or you could buy something for a dime, or things like that. Now, interestingly enough, on this subject of integration, in the 1960 census, Walker County, which is Huntsville as county seat, showed there would be 62 Hispanic individuals living in the county. So if you want to go look up and see what the 2010 census said, you have a nice comparison there between 1960 and 2010.
Wow.
Go pull
That's
the
what the-
statistical abstract of the United States off the shelf and go, or the census data, and take a look at
And that's with the Hispanic community.
There was very little Hispanic, despite the fact that Mexico and Spain had owned Texas previously. Yeah.
Right. So maybe more getting on the side of the. So basically, to clarify, the St. Stephen's Church was involved in those community programs that were propagating, the idea, obviously, of mixing races and, kind of ending the notions of the races not interacting or being segregated. Is that sort of the understanding, or?
Well, understanding that God created the races and there was no point. And God loved the African American man as much as he loved any white
Right.
man or any
Absolutely.
Latino or
Absolutely.
Latina woman. And, that finally began to occur to people that this is not scriptural what we're doing.
Wow, in the church?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. There were not long conversations about it, but I think that's what clearly was going on. Al was gone by 68, so Al Johnson was
Al
no
Johnson
longer.
was. Did his legacy kind of carry on in the church, or was it still at that time his stance was pretty relatively controversial, and so it wasn't?
Oh, it was still controversial in the 60s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
There's just a lot of things where you have to pull people yelling and screaming into the next age.
Wow. Yeah.
That's your job, young people.
Exactly. So, maybe getting more. I'm interested. Like, were there ever, you being a member of the church, and this is something we haven't found, physical copies of. So, this is sort of, and you've talked a lot about this with the legacy, pretty much everything covered here. But being a member of the church, like you just mentioned, like, how did the church, like you just said, maybe more specifically, like, relate theologically? Was there a shift sort of in the doctrine, or was it just kind of understanding that, like you said, like, people were created equally, so there can't, you can't, segregate or have hate towards those people? Or maybe how did the church reconcile the ideas that were occurring around them culturally that had to do with, scripture or sermons or that sort of thing relating
Well, the whole
specifically to the
civil
races?
rights movement forced the church to look at itself.
Right.
I don't think there's any question about that. Of course, the civil rights movement came out of the African American church primarily, missionary Baptist to a very great extent. So here are men of God that are African American that are marching in the streets and forcing the issue, and the brutality of the police and the state police, the local police and the state police, and so many of these marches in an age after television came into being and could show it, really, I think, made people very uncomfortable, made them have to consider things they'd never considered before. Television is a major thing, not only in the election of 1960, where the first television debates took place,
Right,
but in the civil rights marches. And you see people being beaten who are behaving themselves and walking down the street and marching arm in arm and singing "We
Peacefully.
Shall Overcome" or some hymn that you also know. You've got to be pretty sterile of heart not to be touched by it.
Right.
But people don't like those things that make them uncomfortable, and desegregation makes them uncomfortable.
Uh-huh.
Now, and it still does today, and Trump's playing into it. And you can see it.
Mm-hmm. Did the church ever have a period where they had African American members in the church at all, or?
Yes, but that has it started out with the people being a member of the church that are Africans, not African Americans,
They
but
were
Africans.
from Africa.
Yes, we've got Liberians in this church, for
Uh-huh.
example, and some others.
Right.
And so we're probably more integrated right now than I've ever seen.
Oh, wow.
And it's not massive, but it's certainly noticeable.
Right.
One of our vestrymen is a African American staffer at Sam Houston,
Hmm.
who is an African American, Birch's an African direct roots.
Mm-hmm.
The Liberians came over when the Civil War went on in Liberia, and they fled the country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Trump has just ordered all 4,000 of them out.
Hmm. Wow. So how have you seen, growth in the community as far as being accepted of those things, as far as you've experienced possibly, specifically in the church, but possibly outside of it, you obviously being a professor and, kind of seeing the condition of young people, I guess, every year, did you see a change in mentalities over time? Did the attitude of the church contribute to that, as you could see, or is it more of a communal?
Boy, that is hard to say.
Yeah.
There's over 100 churches probably in the Huntsville city
Oh,
limits,
yeah,
and
there's
to
a
try
lot.
to gauge what their impact is and what they're preaching
Right.
is, I don't know.
Right. Maybe just.
What I see now is the preaching in the Episcopal Church is certainly stronger than any time that I remember it. That, equality is something that is pleasing to Christ
Uh-huh.
because he doesn't draw those distinctions.
Right.
So we're getting leadership from the top all the way at the bottom now.
With the Episcopal
Yeah,
Church.
yeah. I can't speak for other denominations, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
I find that I've only been to one other church in Huntsville, and I don't go to other churches very often, but
Right.
that had minorities in.
Right.
And I'm sure that's not accurate as what you should be left with, but I mean, that's,
Mm-hmm. Correct.
you know the old saying that the church is the most segregated hour in America.
Yeah, most segregated time of day
Mhm.
is Sunday service.
Mhm.
It's funny. That's the line of there's an African American rapper. He's a Christian rapper named Lecrae, and that's actually a line in one of his songs that I.
Yeah, well, he
didn't
probably
know.
borrowed it. It's been around a long
Right,
time.
right. Yeah, of course. But that's interesting. Not that he invented it, obviously. But
Yeah.
yeah, most segregated time of day. Sunday service. Yeah. Oh man, I'm trying to think of anything. I don't know if this is going to stop in 45 seconds, but I may.
Well, then
just,
quick.
well, I may just press record again if it does. Just for the past few minutes, but I've got it all right here as well. Yeah, is there anything I'm trying to think of anything? Did you maybe personally see in the church possibly, when did you begin to see the idea of equality specifically between the races preached? Maybe as far as being a member of the church for so long, being involved with the church.
Ooh, well,
Was there a specific time? Was there a specific shift, or was it more more?
I'm seeing it now.
Okay.
I don't recall it.
Sorry, maybe we'll just restart that just in case. The question, if I got cut off, the question was, when have you begun seeing specifically equality preached? And you said
I'd say the last 5 or 6 years.
last 5 or 6 years. Wow. Wow.
Yeah. And there's a lot of urging going on in that department.
Throughout your time in the church, and maybe.
And I think it's the
Sorry.
the racism that raised its head when a black man got elected president.
Uh-huh.
Spurred that on, and then Trump has spurred it on further.
Was there? I think you may have mentioned this. Was there a consistent period of having African Americans in the congregation throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, or was it just kind of sporadic and not necessarily a large?
No, it was sporadic.
Sporadic. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right now, it's more consistent.
It's more consistent now. Okay. And there's actually a large African community from that African countries you mentioned.
Well, one of the things you may not know is that not Sam Houston, but Texas Department of Criminal Justice has been hiring Nigerians
Okay.
to come and work in the prisons because there's such a shortage.
Oh.
And since Nigeria has had Boko Haram and other terrorist groups doing war in the northeastern section of the country, there's people that are happy to leave. We have a huge number of Nigerians that have been brought in just to work in Texas Department of Corrections.
And that's where you work now. Or no, you're retired now,
Yeah.
but right, you're still involved.
And if you're Nigerian and you're Christian, the odds are pretty strong that you come from the Anglican Communion, as it's called, which is the Church of England.
Right. Anglican.
Okay, the Episcopal Church is a part of that Anglican Communion. It's Canadian Church, New Zealand Church, and many of the African churches came out of the Church of England. So when they come to town, some come, here to check us out.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Episcopal is part of the Anglican tradition. Okay, I understand. I wasn't exactly sure how all that worked. You mentioned the legacy. Oh, we may have covered most of it. You had, I guess I had mistakenly thought that you were specifically. I know you mentioned you were a chaplain, a minister here, but then you also mentioned, like I mentioned, we have a bunch of groups that talk, education, even prison systems. So maybe for their benefit, maybe unless you'd want to do another interview, which I'm not sure if you want to do that. I don't know if maybe we should get out of the way now. If yeah. Well, actually, let's see. Oh, sorry. Is there anything else that you wanted to say? I don't want to cut you
find
off.
race relations in prison to be better than they are outside.
Because people are forced to be.
You don't have your choice. Your cellmate may be someone of a different kind, and you got to make it work.
Right.
And the people that I see in prison come into the chapel by their own initiative. So I don't see a representative sample. I don't mean there aren't skinheads in prison. There are.
Right.
But they're declining. When you're together a long time, as the guys mature, racism seems to mellow a lot.
So, do you preach in the prison?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, so what you mentioned chaplain? So is that a role?
The Diocese of Texas appointed me to be chaplain to the prisons, and so I can go and do one-on-one if somebody requests me. I'm a part of the Kairos Prison Ministry, which is the largest prison ministry in the world. I've done Bridges to Life, which is a restorative justice ministry in the prisons. And I can take communion or, just listen. The main thing these guys have is nobody to listen to.
That's right.
So they're a number. They lose a lot of humanity in prison.
Yeah. Strip that away. Well, I'm trying to think if there's any summative thoughts.
What I would like to see in town is
Your hope?
Some of the churches work together of all colors, any color. There's not much of that. It's kind of like they say, everybody in their own silo.
Right.
And we're called to be outside these walls and in the community. And we need to be in the community together. as far as Scripture is concerned, there's one church,
That's right.
not 300 different varieties.
Yeah,
It's one
varieties.
church led by one man.
Yeah. Wow.
So
Okay.
I can tell you this: one time I saw an ad in the Huntsville Item that's talking about a weekend, a brotherhood type weekend at one of the churches, and I talked my guys into going. And we got there and we found out we had just arrived at a black church,
Okay.
and it was over there off 11th Street in Sycamore in that
Uh-huh.
area, if you know where that is. And we went in, and we had a wonderful time. They were so gracious, and I'm sure that they were surprised when we walked in the door, but we couldn't have been received any better and had a great
Uh-huh.
weekend.
By the church.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's hard to dislike people you meet and know.
Yeah. And
The
it's hard-
problem is we're living in our own separate areas, and the news media today, which is polite to call some of it news versus propaganda, is doing its dead level best to create friction in society.
Polarity. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're paying a terrible price for it.
Hmm. So, just to clarify, St. Stephen Church, obviously, but do you know if it was ever segregated previously? Maybe talking before the 60s, 50s?
I suspect under state law it had been illegal not to have been segregated
Okay.
at most of the time, and I don't know that.
Right. This
Ask
is-
those history professors over there. I mean,
Okay.
segregation was state law.
Right, yes.
Now, how far it went, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what the merchants learned when they did agree to desegregate so many of the downtown shopping areas in the South is we've been missing out on a whole lot of money.
We had a book that talked about that.
Yeah.
Talked all about the advertising of the
And
separate races, Aunt Jemima and
Yeah.
all
yeah.
the like.
Yeah, and so some of them said, this really is all right. Unfortunately, not for the right reasons, they came to the conclusion that segregation made no sense.
Right. Well, we had talked about this, might maybe more off the cuff, but we talked about previously, a book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm.
That book, we read that in class, and how, there were plenty of people that weren't for segregation. They were like, it didn't make any sense to, they may not have viewed the races as totally equal, but it didn't make any sense to actually make it a law to where they couldn't be together, because it's even more so in the South, because they had always interacted together, and there hadn't been this need to separate the races. That didn't make much sense to a lot of people. Even Northerners that came down to the South were like, experiencing, in some places, less segregation, because in the North it had been, I guess, in the cities, I think, segregated quite a bit, even in the...
Well, economics segregates us,
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Yeah,
And yeah, I mean, you can see that in Huntsville.
right. Oh, man. Well, is there any... I don't know, I think we talked about a lot. The religious aspect is what we're specifically focusing on, but a lot of helpful information, context, and for other groups. Church. So overall, did the Episcopal Church that you experienced take a more progressive stance in that area of racial relations? And although it still may have been majority white, there was never a time when they didn't, weren't welcoming possibly of African Americans, or
I don't.
Did you have any personal
I've never seen
relations or any interactions with the African American?
Certainly, I've never seen anybody barred from the door because of
Right.
race.
Right.
If they didn't like it, they muttering to themselves
Mm-hmm.
because intellectually they know that they're wrong.
They can't. Yeah, they can't get over their own
Yeah.
emotional biases.
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time. Are there any other closing thoughts you have, possibly, regarding any race relations and religion and how you've seen it? Or I know you said a lot.
No, other than there's a motto called E pluribus unum, out of many, one. It's time that we headed for the one
Be unified.
and embraced people that are not like us as nonetheless a part of God's
Yeah.
creation.
Yeah, we can all share in and
Yeah.
what Jesus did. Equal. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.